I have spent most of my life camping. Started when I was a kid, something my dad would take me out to do every summer. Back then, it was a fun thing, no real dangers, just the usual lessons about being careful, carrying a knife, and respecting the land. As I got older, I started going alone, enjoying the silence of the woods. The first time I ever felt real fear while camping was in 2015, somewhere deep in the Ozarks. I was 32 then, living in Arkansas, and had just gone through a rough patch in life. Work stress, relationship stress, everything was piling up. So I packed my gear, picked a random spot on the map, and drove out into the mountains to clear my head. I wanted isolation, real isolation, away from roads, trails, or campsites. Just me and the wild. I parked my truck on the side of an old dirt road that barely looked like it was used anymore. The trees were thick and there was no clear path, but I liked that. I grabbed my pack and rifle, locked up the truck, and started hiking in. The first few hours were peaceful. The further I went, the quieter it got. No hum of distant cars, no voices, just wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of animals. The terrain was rough, lots of thick underbrush and uneven ground, but I kept moving until I found a good clearing next to a slow-moving creek. It was the perfect spot. Flat ground, water nearby, and plenty of firewood. I set up camp, built a fire, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun dipped, the temperature dropped, and I pulled my jacket tighter. Sitting by the fire, I finally felt that sense of peace I had been looking for. It was just me and the wild, no distractions. But as the night dragged on, that peace started to shift into something else. First, it was small things. The way the wind stopped completely, leaving the woods in an unnatural silence. The way the fire felt like it wasn't pushing back enough of the darkness. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar area. But then I started hearing things. Not normal forest noises, but something else. It started with the sound of twigs snapping. Not the random, scattered cracks from falling branches, but deliberate steps. Slow, heavy. It was coming from somewhere beyond my fire's light. I turned my head toward the sound, but there was nothing, just the black outline of trees. I grabbed my rifle and held it across my lap, telling myself it was probably a deer or a hog moving through the brush. Still, something about it didn't feel right. Animals are skittish. They don't move toward a fire like that. The sound stopped for a while, and I tried to shake the feeling off, but it didn't last. Later, as I lay in my tent, I heard it again. Closer, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Not fast, not darting like an animal, but slow, careful steps. Stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the dark fabric of my tent, waiting for something to happen. But after a while, the noises faded, and I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a raccoon sniffing around, nothing more. By morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was up, the birds were chirping, and I almost laughed at myself for being so on edge the night before. I spent the day hiking, collecting firewood, and trying to enjoy the trip, but that feeling never fully left. As night came again, I built up the fire bigger this time. I didn't want as much darkness creeping in. The air was cold, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. I ate, sat by the fire for a while, then finally decided to call it a night. That's when I noticed it. My gear had been moved. Not much, but enough. My backpack, which I had left leaning against a tree, was now on its side. My mess kit had been pulled out, the metal utensils scattered on the ground. My rifle, which I had leaned against my tent, was now lying flat. Someone had been in my camp. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the rifle and slowly turned, scanning the trees. The fire cracked, but beyond that, the woods were still. Too still. Then a sound. Not from the trees, but from the other side of the creek. A splash. I turned toward the water, my eyes straining in the dim light. The creek wasn't deep, maybe up to my knees, but it was wide enough that I couldn't see the other bank clearly. Then another splash. Something or someone was crossing the water. I raised the rifle, my heart hammering in my chest. For the longest time, nothing moved. No more splashes, no more sounds. I stood there waiting, the fire at my back. The hairs on my arms stood up. Then, just barely within the firelight, I saw it. A figure. Not an animal, not a shadow, an actual figure. Standing just beyond the creek, half hidden by the trees. I couldn't make out details, just the shape of a person, tall, standing completely still. Watching. I didn't hesitate. I raised the rifle and fired a shot into the air. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the trees. When the ringing in my ears faded, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, rifle in hand, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The woods stayed quiet. Too quiet. By morning, I packed up. I didn't waste time cooking, didn't take a last look around. I just grabbed my gear and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole way I felt watched. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. I moved fast, not stopping, not resting, just pushing forward. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my pack into the bed, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back at the trees one last time, and that's when I saw it again. A figure, standing at the tree line, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I just drove. I don't know who or what I saw out there. A drifter? A hunter? Someone living off the grid? I have no idea. But I've camped all my life, and I have never felt fear like that. I still camp, but never like that again. Never that deep, never that isolated. Somewhere in those woods, someone was watching me, and they wanted me to know it. I never thought I'd find myself camping in a graveyard. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't some thrill-seeking stunt or a dare gone wrong. It was just bad luck. I was on a solo hiking trip, something I did every few months to clear my head. It was early autumn, and the air had that sharp edge to it, crisp and clean. I'd set out in the morning, following an old, barely maintained trail that cut through miles of dense woodland. The trees stretched high above, their branches intertwining like locked fingers, shutting out most of the daylight. I'd planned everything carefully, packed enough supplies, mapped out my route, and double-checked the weather forecast. But plans don't mean much when you get lost. Somewhere along the way, I must have taken a wrong turn. The trail markers disappeared, and soon I was wandering through an unmarked stretch of forest, the trees pressing in on all sides. My GPS had no signal. My map was useless. I walked for hours, hoping to find a road or at least another hiker, but I saw no one. Just the endless trees and the sound of my own footsteps crunching over dry leaves. Then, as the sky darkened and the first hints of dusk settled in, I saw it. Clearing, and in the middle of it, an old graveyard. The place looked forgotten. The iron gate was rusted and half broken, leaning at an angle as if it had been shoved aside by time. The headstones were cracked and covered in moss, some tilted, others completely fallen. A few stone crosses stood tall, their edges worn smooth by years of wind and rain. It didn't look like anyone had visited in decades. I had no choice but to stop. The sun was slipping fast, and I couldn't risk stumbling through the woods in the dark. I was exhausted, and setting up camp here, no matter how unsettling, was better than breaking an ankle in the middle of nowhere. I chose a flat patch of ground near the fence, careful not to pitch my tent too close to the graves. I wasn't superstitious, but sleeping on top of someone's final resting place just felt wrong. The air was colder here, heavier. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves filled my lungs. As I set up my tent, I told myself there was nothing unusual about this place. It was just another patch of land, no different from any other clearing in the woods. Just stones and dirt, nothing more. But as the last light drained from the sky, that logic started to feel thinner. The silence was thick, too thick. The forest behind me, which had been alive with birds and rustling branches all day, had gone completely still. No wind, no chirping insects, just a heavy, waiting silence. I forced myself to ignore it. I unrolled my sleeping bag, turned on my lantern, and made a quick dinner. Dehydrated food never tasted good. But tonight, it was especially hard to choke down. My stomach was tight, like my body was bracing for something I couldn't see. I kept my lantern on longer than usual. The soft yellow light stretched out in a small circle around my tent, pushing back the darkness just enough. Beyond it, the graveyard melted into shadows, the headstones barely visible. I stared at them for a while, my eyes tracing the worn edges of names I couldn't read. Then I heard it, a sound, faint, almost too soft to notice. It came from somewhere in the graveyard, a rustling, a shift of movement on dry leaves. I told myself it was an animal, a fox, a raccoon, maybe a deer moving through the undergrowth. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. The sound came again, closer, a slow, dragging noise, not the light step of an animal, something heavier. I turned off my lantern. The darkness swallowed everything. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, too loud. I sat frozen, my breath shallow, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, just as I started to convince myself I'd imagined it, a crunch, right outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't blink. My body locked up, every muscle screaming to run, but I couldn't. The tent fabric was thin, too thin. Whatever was outside, if I made a noise, if I shifted even an inch, it would hear me. The air pressed down on me, thick and unmoving. Another sound, not footsteps, breathing, slow, deep, right outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from whatever was out there. I clenched my hands into fists, forcing myself to stay still. My brain scrambled for logic, for an explanation that wasn't the thing my gut was screaming at me. Then the breathing stopped. Silence. Seconds crawled by. Then the zipper. A slow tug. Someone was trying to open my tent. I didn't think. I moved. I lunged for my pack, grabbed my hunting knife, and yanked the zipper from the inside before whoever was outside could open it. My breath came hard and fast. My fingers locked around the knife handle. Silence. I didn't know if they were still out there. I didn't want to know. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the tent wall, knife ready. At some point, exhaustion took over. My body couldn't handle the fear anymore. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because when I woke up, the sun was rising. My body ached. My head felt foggy, like I hadn't really slept. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the soft morning light filtering through the fabric of my tent. Then I remembered. I unzipped the tent slowly, my hands shaking. The graveyard looked the same as it had the night before. Empty, silent, nothing out of place, except for one thing: footprints. Deep, fresh footprints in the damp earth, leading from the trees, stopping right outside my tent, and nowhere else. Whoever had been out there never left. They just stood there, watching, waiting. I packed up my gear in minutes. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about anything except getting out. I followed the clearest path I could find, walking fast, nearly running. I didn't stop. Hours later, I found a road, a car, a ride back to town. I never told anyone. I never went back, and I never camped alone again. I used to enjoy camping alone. Something about being out in the wilderness, away from everything, made me feel at ease. I worked in construction, and after weeks of long hours, there was nothing better than getting away for a few days. No ringing phones, no traffic, no deadlines. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. That changed one summer. I had a spot I always went to, deep in the national forest about 3 hours from my home. It wasn't an official campsite, no paved roads, no bathrooms, no fire pits. Just a clearing I found years ago, surrounded by thick trees and far from any trails. I never saw another person there. That was the whole point. I left early in the morning, packed light but brought the essentials. Tent, food, rifle. I had seen black bears out there before, and I didn't take chances. I also carried a pistol on my hip. Not for animals, just in case I ran into people. People were worse than any predator. The drive was peaceful. The roads turned from asphalt to gravel to dirt, then narrowed until they were barely wider than my truck. No tire tracks ahead of me, no signs of anyone around. I parked where I always did, off the road, hidden behind some brush. I hiked in a few miles, found my usual spot, and set up camp. The first day was uneventful. I fished a little, cooked over a small fire, and enjoyed the quiet. I always kept my rifle close, but I never needed it. I saw a few deer, some squirrels, the usual. As the sun set, I felt at ease. The air was cool, the fire crackled, and the stars came out one by one. It was in the middle of the night that things changed. I woke up suddenly, not to a noise. That was the problem, there was no noise. The woods were silent. No wind, no crickets, no owls. Just stillness. That wasn't right. Anyone who spent time in the woods knows it's never completely quiet. I lay there, listening, staring at the ceiling of my tent. My rifle was next to me. I reached for it without thinking, gripping it tight. Then I heard it. A single footstep. Not an animal. It was heavy, deliberate, human. Came from the edge of the clearing, near the tree line. I stayed still, barely breathing. Another step. Closer. I'd been in the woods long enough to tell the difference between a deer stepping through brush and a person trying to move quietly. This was the second one. I shifted slowly, reaching for the zipper on my tent. I had no intention of calling out. If someone was out here, they had no good reason to be. And if they were trying to sneak up on me, they meant harm. I unzipped just enough to see outside. The fire had burned low, just embers glowing red. The trees were dark shadows against the night sky. First, I saw nothing. Then I saw movement. Something stood just inside the tree line. First, I thought it was a man, but something was off. It was too tall, too thin. Its arms hung low, longer than they should have been. It didn't move like a person, more like an animal. Slow, cautious. I tightened my grip on my rifle. It stepped forward, into the faint glow of the embers. It looked wrong. The skin was pale, almost gray. The shape of its body was human, but it wasn't. Its joints bent in ways they shouldn't. Its head tilted unnaturally, like it was listening. Then it spoke. My blood ran cold. It used my voice, not just similar. It was exact. The tone, the rhythm, like hearing a recording of myself. It repeated a single word. Hello, then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Took another step. I raised my rifle. My finger hovered over the trigger, but I didn't fire. Something in the back of my mind screamed not to. Then it moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. One moment it stood at the tree line. The next, it was just feet from my tent. I fired. The blast lit up the trees. The thing jerked, but it didn't fall. It made a sound, a horrible, twisting sound, like bones snapping. Then it turned and ran. Not like a man, not like an animal, something else. I heard it crashing through the woods. faster than any human could run. Then silence again. I didn't sleep. I sat there, rifle ready, listening. It didn't come back. The first light, I packed up. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I just wanted out. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Tracks. They led from the trees to my tent. Long, deep impressions like a man walking barefoot. But the toes were wrong. Too long. Too many joints. I followed them with my eyes. They led back into the woods. Then they stopped. Not faded. Not covered. Just stopped. Like whatever made them had vanished. I didn't try to make sense of it. I just left. The drive home felt longer than before. I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see something behind me. When I got home, I locked every door, closed every curtain. For days, I jumped at every sound. I never went back to that spot. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that I was just tired, that I let my mind play tricks on me. But I know what I saw, and I know it saw me too. It was early autumn when I decided to go camping alone in the French countryside. I had been working long hours, stuck in an office, and needed a break from the city. I wanted solitude, fresh air, and the quiet of nature. I had done solo camping trips before, but this time I planned to go deeper into the wilderness, away from campsites and tourist trails. I chose a remote forest in eastern France, a place I had read about in a travel guide. It was known for its dense woods, rolling hills, and almost complete lack of human presence. That was exactly what I was looking for. I packed light but made sure I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a small gas stove, enough food and water for 3 days, a knife, a flashlight, and my phone with an external battery. I drove out of the city in the morning, enjoying the changing landscape as buildings turned into open fields, then thick forests. The roads got narrower, winding through the trees, until I reached the small gravel path where I planned to park. I left my car hidden behind some bushes, grabbed my backpack, and started hiking deeper into the forest. It took me about 2 hours to find a good spot, a clearing surrounded by trees, far from any trails. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag inside, and gathered some firewood. By late afternoon, I had everything ready. I sat on a fallen log, drinking a bottle of water and listening to the sounds around me. The wind rustled the leaves, birds called to each other, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear a stream. It was peaceful. As the sun started setting, I lit my small fire and cooked a simple meal: boiled rice with some canned meat. I ate slowly, enjoying the warmth of the fire against the cool evening air. The forest had a different feeling at night. The sounds changed. The birds went quiet, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames, letting my mind relax. I wasn't thinking about work, about emails, about deadlines. I was just there in the moment. But then, as I looked into the darkness beyond the firelight, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A figure. First, I thought it was a tree, but then it moved. A person, standing just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. A woman. She was facing me, but I couldn't see her features clearly. She wasn't moving towards me, just standing there, watching. I felt my pulse quicken. Who was she? There were no houses nearby, no villages for miles. I had hiked deep into the forest. No one should be here. I stared at her, waiting for her to do something, say something, but she didn't. She just stood there, barely visible in the dim light. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe she was a hiker, lost and looking for help, but something felt off. Her posture, the way she just stood there. If she needed help, why wasn't she saying anything? I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence. She didn't react. I reached for my flashlight, keeping my eyes on her. The moment I turned it on and aimed the beam at her, she moved. Not towards me, but away, stepping back into the trees. I barely got a glimpse of her face before she disappeared into the darkness. Pale skin, dark, unkempt hair. Her clothes looked old, tattered. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, my heart pounding. I listened for footsteps, for any sign that she was still nearby, but I heard nothing, just the wind through the trees. For a long time, I didn't move. Then, slowly, I reached for my knife and kept it close. I told myself that maybe she had been just as startled as I was. Maybe she had been camping nearby, had seen my fire, and was curious. But the way she had stood there, completely silent, unsettled me. Eventually, I forced myself to go inside my tent. I kept the knife next to me and left the flashlight on. I listened for any sounds outside, but the forest was silent. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise made me tense up. Several times, I thought I heard something moving outside, but when I held my breath and listened closely, there was nothing. Morning came slowly. The moment the sun was up, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, more ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. I walked around the clearing, looking for any sign that she had been there. Footprints, broken branches, anything. I found nothing. If she had been there, she had moved without disturbing the ground. That didn't make sense. The forest floor was covered in leaves, twigs. Even I had left footprints. I considered packing up and leaving, but I had come all this way for a break, and I didn't want to let one strange encounter ruin my trip. So I decided to stay, but I kept my knife on me at all times. The day passed without anything strange happening. I hiked a bit, gathered more firewood, cooked another meal. As the sun started setting, I felt that same unease creeping back in. The moment darkness fell, I kept my flashlight close, my knife in my hand. I didn't see her that night, but I felt like I was being watched. I kept turning my head, scanning the darkness, expecting to see her standing there again. At some point, exhaustion won. I went inside my tent, but I didn't sleep deeply. Every sound kept me on edge. The third night was worse. I had convinced myself that she was gone, that maybe I had imagined how strange she had been. But that night, I woke up to a sound right outside my tent. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing. Not an animal. Not the wind. Someone was standing right outside. I gripped my knife, my body frozen. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then a sound, a slow, dragging movement, like something being pulled across the ground. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't unzip my tent. I just lay there, knife in hand, waiting for morning. When the sun finally rose, I gathered my things as quickly as possible. I stepped outside, my hands shaking. There were marks on the ground. Long, dragged footprints leading away from my tent into the woods. I followed them for a few steps, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't wait to see if she would come back. I packed my tent, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and hiked back to my car without stopping. As I drove away from the forest, I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing at the tree line, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the trees. I don't know who she was, why she was out there, or what she wanted. But I know one thing, I'll never go camping alone again. I had been hunting alone for years. It was something I enjoyed, being out in the wild with nothing but my rifle, my gear, and the silence of the woods. It wasn't about the kill for me. It was about the peace, the isolation, and the challenge. This time, I had picked a spot deep in the mountains of Montana, far from any roads or people. I had driven up as far as my truck would go, then hiked another 5 miles with my gear strapped to my back. The plan was simple: set up camp near a river, track deer or elk for a few days, and then head home. I had done this dozens of times before, but this time felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the weather. The sky had been gray the entire drive up, thick with low clouds that never quite broke into rain but kept the forest dark even in the middle of the day. The air had a damp, heavy feel to it, and the wind barely moved through the trees. I found a decent clearing to set up camp, about 20 yards from the river. It wasn't a perfect spot, but it would do. The trees were thick around me, providing some cover, but not so dense that I couldn't see if something or someone was approaching. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. As I ate, I listened to the sounds of the forest. Something was off. Normally, even at dusk, you could hear the usual forest sounds: birds, rustling leaves, the occasional crack of a branch as an animal moved through the brush. But tonight, it was almost dead silent. The only sound was the water moving through the river, steady and constant. I told myself I was overthinking things. Sometimes the woods just got quiet. Maybe a predator was nearby, a mountain lion maybe. That would explain the silence. I'd seen them before on hunts, but they usually avoided people. I finished eating, put out the fire, and crawled into my tent. I always kept my rifle close when I was out alone, so I laid it beside me as I settled in for the night. The first few hours were uneventful. I dozed in and out of sleep, waking up occasionally at the slightest sound outside. It was just the wind, I told myself, just the trees shifting. But then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard something, a single sharp snap of a twig. My eyes opened instantly. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I sat up slowly, reaching for my rifle, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any more movement. The silence had returned. The kind of silence that wasn't natural. The kind that meant something was nearby, waiting. I waited for what felt like forever, but I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had just been a small animal, a raccoon, maybe. I laid back down, still gripping my rifle. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. The forest had its sounds back, birds chirping, the wind moving through the trees. I shook off the uneasy feeling from the night before, packed my gear, and headed out to track some deer. I moved slowly through the woods, scanning for tracks, broken branches, anything that might give away an animal's movement. After about an hour, I found fresh tracks leading uphill. I followed them, keeping quiet, stepping carefully over leaves and twigs. Then I saw it. Not a deer, not an elk. A footprint. It was human, barefoot. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at it. It wasn't old. The edges were still sharp in the dirt, meaning whoever had made it had been here recently. 100 thoughts ran through my head. Who the hell would be out here walking around barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I was miles from any roads, and I hadn't seen a single sign of another camper or hunter. I crouched down, studying it. The size was strange, long, narrow. The toes were splayed out like whoever had made it had been gripping the ground with their feet. It wasn't normal. I stood up and looked around, scanning the trees, the rocks, the brush. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept moving, rifle in hand, more alert now. My hunt was over. I didn't care about tracking deer anymore. I just wanted to figure out what the hell was going on. As I made my way back toward camp, I found more footprints. They were leading toward my campsite. I picked up my pace, my heart thudding in my chest. I moved as quickly as I could without making too much noise, every instinct in me screaming that something was wrong. When I got back to my camp, my stomach dropped. My gear was still there, but something was off. My tent flap was open. I had zipped it closed before I left. I stepped forward cautiously, rifle raised. I pushed the tent flap aside and looked inside. Nothing, but my sleeping bag had been moved. Not thrown or dragged, just shifted, like someone had been inside and had sat there for a while. I backed out of the tent, scanning the trees. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I needed to leave. Now, I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into my bag. I didn't bother rolling up my tent properly. I just shoved it in and slung my pack over my shoulders. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. A twig snapping. This time it was close. Too close. I spun around, rifle raised, scanning the trees. Nothing. I started moving fast. I didn't run, but I walked as quickly as I could without making too much noise. My truck was 5 miles away. I needed to get there. I kept my rifle ready, my eyes darting from tree to tree. Every few minutes, I heard something behind me. A rustle, a footstep, a breath. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The feeling of being watched never left me. The entire hike back, I felt it, like something was just beyond my sight, waiting. When I finally saw my truck, I nearly collapsed from relief. I practically ran the last stretch, yanked open the door, and threw my gear inside. I didn't take my time getting out of there. I fired up the engine, slammed it into gear, and tore down the dirt road faster than I ever had before. As I drove, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw something step out of the trees. Tall, thin, watching. But by the time I blinked, it was gone. I never went back to that spot again. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the wilderness. Not in a survivalist way, but in a way where I could just be away from everything. No noise, no people, no stress. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees, the crunch of dirt under my boots, the steady crackling of a fire as I sat back and let my mind go blank. That's why I started taking solo camping trips a few times a year. I'd pick a place deep in the woods, somewhere away from trails and crowds, and I'd spend a few days just existing out there. I wasn't reckless about it. I always packed enough supplies, carried a satellite phone in case of emergencies, and told someone where I'd be. I had done this for years without a problem. But last year, something changed. I had planned a week-long camping trip in a remote part of the Pacific Northwest, somewhere far enough from people that I wouldn't hear another human voice the entire time I was there. I had scouted the area months before and picked a spot near a small lake, surrounded by thick forest. There was no road leading to it, no cabins nearby, nothing but miles and miles of wilderness in every direction. It was perfect. I drove as far as the old logging roads would take me, then hiked the rest of the way in with my gear. It took me most of the day to reach my campsite, and by the time I got there, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked myself a quick meal. Everything felt right. The first night was uneventful. I listened to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day, I explored the area, made sure I was familiar with the land, and checked for any signs of large predators. The last thing I wanted was to stumble across a bear's territory without knowing it. But I found nothing out of the ordinary. No tracks, no scat, no claw marks on trees. Just untouched wilderness. That night, as I sat by the fire, I started to feel something strange. Not fear exactly, but an odd kind of unease. Like I was being watched. It made no sense. There was no one out here. I hadn't seen a single person since I left my truck. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I shook it off, crawled into my tent, and forced myself to sleep. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was close. A light, shuffling noise just outside my tent. Not an animal, not a person walking normally, more like something moving low to the ground, dragging itself over the dirt and leaves. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I lay there, waiting, my heart pounding in my ears, but I heard nothing else. After a long time, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it had just been the wind. Maybe a branch had fallen. I didn't know. The next morning, I checked around my tent but saw nothing strange. No footprints, no disturbed earth. Just normal forest floor. I told myself I was being paranoid. But that night, it happened again. This time, it was worse. I had just gotten into my sleeping bag when I heard it. The same shuffling sound, slow and deliberate, moving around the tent. Closer this time. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves, the slight scratch of something against the nylon of my tent. I stayed completely still. Then something pressed against the fabric. Not hard, not aggressive, just a slow, deliberate pressure, right near my head. I nearly stopped breathing. I stayed that way for what felt like an eternity, my body frozen, my mind racing. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the pressure disappeared. The sound moved away, and then it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I got up and checked the area again. Still nothing. No tracks. No signs of anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself I was just spooking myself out, that it was all in my head. I had spent years camping alone. I had never had a problem before. Why would this time be any different? So I stayed. That was a mistake. The fourth night was when I finally understood that I needed to leave. I had built my fire higher than usual, trying to push back the darkness. The unease had been growing all day, like an itch in the back of my mind. The forest felt different, quieter. The usual night sounds were gone. No insects, no rustling in the bushes, no distant owl calls, just silence. Then, as I sat there, I saw something. Not clearly, just movement deep in the trees. A shifting of shadows, a brief break in the darkness. Something was out there, watching me. I forced myself to stay calm. If it was an animal, I didn't want to startle it. If it was a person, well, I didn't know what they wanted, but I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me panic. I kept my knife close, my headlamp ready. Hours passed. Then, just as I started to think maybe it was all in my head, I heard it again. The shuffling. But this time, it wasn't near my tent. It was near the fire. I didn't move. Slowly, I reached for my light and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness. And for just a second, less than a second, I saw something. A shape, low to the ground, just beyond the firelight. Then it was gone. That was enough for me. I didn't wait until morning. I packed my gear as fast as I could, doused the fire, and started hiking out. I had a GPS, I knew the way back, and I wasn't going to spend another minute in that place. The whole way I felt it. The watching, the quiet, the sense that something was just behind me, just out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove until I hit pavement. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I haven't been back since, and I never will. The last time I saw my brother was in the fall of 2013. It was during a routine army training exercise in the remote forests of Montana. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year, and I had no idea he would be anywhere near where we were. Seeing him out there, in the middle of nowhere, wasn't just unexpected, it was disturbing. I remember the cold, the kind that crawled under your clothes, even with the thickest layers. The trees stretched for miles, dark and unyielding. The only sounds were the rustling of the wind through the branches and the crunch of damp leaves under our boots. I was part of a small unit sent out for a long-range recon drill. Just 6 of us, all carrying heavy rucksacks, rifles, and enough gear to last 3 days. We were meant to move deep into the woods, set up an observation post, and report back. Simple on paper, but nothing ever stays simple. The first day went as planned. We hiked over 10 miles through rugged terrain, moving in a staggered formation. The forest was thick, but we followed an old hunting trail, using GPS coordinates to check our position. By late afternoon, we reached our designated area, a clearing near a small, slow-moving river. We spread out, set up our camouflaged observation post, and took turns on watch. The night was uneventful, though the distant howls of coyotes kept us alert. On the second day, things changed. It started with footprints. One of the guys, Carter, spotted them first. Deep impressions in the damp earth, slightly smudged from the wind. They weren't from any of us. The spacing was wrong, and they were fresh. Someone had been moving through the woods near our position, sometime during the night. We didn't panic. It was hunting season, and civilians sometimes wandered too far off trail. Still, we had orders. If we saw anyone, we were to observe from a distance and avoid contact. We decided to reposition slightly, moving deeper into the treeline for better cover. By evening, the forest felt different. The air had a weight to it, thick and pressing. Every small sound seemed louder. A snapping twig made us all freeze. We weren't alone. That night, I took the second watch. The cold had deepened, and mist clung to the ground like low-lying smoke. The trees were tall and shadowy, barely swaying in the wind. I kept my rifle close, scanning the darkness. Then I saw him. At first, I thought it was one of our guys checking the perimeter. A tall figure stood just beyond the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the branches. My heart pounded. I gripped my rifle, peering closer. Then he stepped forward. Even in the dim light, I recognized him. The build, the way he carried himself. It was my brother. I blinked hard, my mind racing. He wasn't supposed to be here. Last I heard, he had left the army. He had vanished from my life, cutting contact with me and the rest of our family. But now, here he was, standing in the middle of the forest, watching me. I wanted to call out, but something in me hesitated. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. He didn't move like I remembered. His stance was off, rigid, unnatural. And he wasn't dressed like a soldier. No gear, no pack, just dark clothing that blended too well with the night. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees without a sound. I stayed frozen for a long time, gripping my rifle until my hands ached. When my shift ended, I didn't say anything to the others. I barely slept. The next day, I checked the area where I had seen him. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on me. Then Carter saw him too. It was mid-afternoon when he whispered to me, his face pale. "There's someone watching us," he said, barely moving his lips. I followed his gaze. There, deeper in the trees, stood my brother. The same position as last night. Same posture. Same silent stare. Then he was gone. Carter looked at me, his expression tight with unease. Who the hell was that? I didn't answer. That evening, we decided to pack up and move. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away, and the others were getting nervous. We broke down our camp, moving under the cover of dusk. Then we found the cabin. It wasn't on our map. A small, run-down structure half hidden by dense undergrowth. It looked abandoned. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, a rusted metal door barely hanging on its hinges. No windows. No signs of recent activity. But the door was open. We hesitated. We should have left it alone, but curiosity got the better of us. Inside, the air was thick and stale. The walls were covered in old newspaper clippings, all yellowed with age. The floor was bare except for a single, rotting mattress in the corner. But what made my stomach tighten was what was on the walls. Pictures, dozens of them, of me, of my family, of my brother. Some were old photos I remembered from childhood. Others were more recent. Some I didn't even know had been taken. And then there were the notes, scratched into the wood, barely legible. My name, my brother's name, repeated over and over again. The others saw it too. No one spoke. No one needed to. Then we heard footsteps outside. Heavy, slow. We killed the lights, pressing ourselves against the walls. The footsteps circled the cabin, deliberate, measured. Then they stopped. For the longest time, we waited, listening to the silence. Then a soft scratching sound started at the door. A slow, deliberate scraping like nails dragging over the metal. We didn't move. Minutes passed, then hours. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the walls, we finally dared to move. When we stepped outside, the forest was empty. The footprints in the dirt were deep, circling the cabin again and again. But they weren't human. The spacing was wrong. The depth was uneven, like someone or something had been crawling. We didn't stay. We hiked back, moving fast, barely speaking. When we finally reached the main camp, I went straight to the CO. I told him everything. He listened. Then he looked at me, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing out there," he said. "That cabin burned down years ago." I didn't argue. I just nodded and left. I never saw my brother again. To this day, I don't know if he was really there or if something else was wearing his face. But I never went back into those woods, and I never will. I should have checked the weather before heading out. The rain started in the late afternoon, coming down in a slow drizzle at first, soaking into the ground, turning the dirt into thick, heavy mud. I was miles away from anyone, deep in the woods, setting up camp by a narrow, winding river. The trees were tall and packed closely together, their branches swaying under the weight of the rain. The air smelled of damp earth, pine, and the faint metallic scent of wet stone. I had chosen this spot for its seclusion. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a clearing I had found on an old map, a place where few people ever wandered. It was the kind of spot you'd never know existed unless you were looking for it. I had taken a rough trail to get here, one that was more of an overgrown path, barely visible in places. My boots were caked in mud by the time I arrived, and the rain was already seeping through my jacket. I pitched my tent near the river, making sure to keep a safe distance from the bank. The ground here was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and slick roots. I worked quickly, driving the stakes into the ground, pulling the rainfly tight. The sound of the river mixed with the steady tapping of rain against my tarp, creating a rhythmic noise that filled the air. It was peaceful in a way, but also isolating. As I unpacked my gear, I felt the cold settling into my bones. My fingers were stiff from the damp air. I set up a small fire, just enough to warm my hands and dry my socks. The flames flickered weakly in the rain, struggling against the moisture-heavy air. I sat close to it, watching the embers glow, listening to the sounds of the forest. The woods had a different feel in the rain. The usual rustling of small animals was muffled, and the usual chirping of birds had faded away. It was too quiet, aside from the occasional creak of tree branches or the distant splash of the river. I was used to being alone on camping trips, but something about this place made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the trees stood so close together, their trunks dark with rain, their branches twisting overhead like tangled fingers. As night fell, the rain picked up, It came down harder now, a steady downpour that hissed as it struck the river. My fire was barely holding on, its glow shrinking against the wet air. I decided to turn in for the night, crawling into my tent and zipping myself inside. The inside was dry for now, but I could hear the rain drumming against the fabric, the sound constant and heavy. I lay there listening. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a branch snap. It wasn't the kind of noise that comes from a branch simply breaking under the weight of water. It was deliberate, sharp, quick, like something had stepped on it. I tensed, holding my breath. The rain masked a lot of sounds, but that one had been close. I waited, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. Nothing, just the rain, just the wind shifting through the trees. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. Probably a deer moving through the woods, maybe an old branch giving way under its own weight. I forced myself to relax, closing my eyes, letting the sound of the rain lull me to sleep. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up again. Something had changed. The air inside the tent felt heavier, thicker. The rain was still falling, but there was another noise now, a faint, rhythmic sound. Footsteps. I held my breath. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They crunched against the wet leaves, moving just outside my tent. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Who would be out here? This was deep in the woods, far from any main trails. No one should be here. No one else should even know this place existed. I lay still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps moved closer. They stopped just outside my tent. I could see the faint shadow of something standing there, just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. The rain distorted the shape, but I could tell it was tall. Human, just standing there. My mind raced. I hadn't heard anyone approaching earlier. No voices, no distant sounds of movement. Whoever this was, they had walked right up to my tent without making a sound until now. I gripped the handle of my knife, keeping it close to my chest. Minutes passed. The shadow didn't move. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, just as slowly as it had come, the shadow disappeared. The footsteps retreated, fading back into the rain. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but the way my body was reacting told me otherwise. My instincts were screaming at me. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting, nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came, gray and cold. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, the sky still heavy with clouds. I unzipped my tent slowly, my muscles stiff from tension. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the damp earth. And then I saw them. Footprints. They circled my tent. Not just once, over and over. Someone had been walking around my tent for a long time. The prints were deep, pressed into the mud. I followed them with my eyes, my stomach twisting into knots. They led toward the trees, disappearing into the undergrowth. I turned, scanning the woods. Nothing, just trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. I packed my gear quickly, my hands shaking. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of wind, made my skin crawl. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone watching me. The hike back to my car felt longer than before. The woods, which had seemed peaceful the day before, now felt suffocating. I moved fast, barely stopping, my heart hammering the entire time. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. My hands were slick with sweat. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the trail one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw movement. A figure standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Watching. I didn't wait to get a better look. I drove away, not stopping, not looking back. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that I won't be camping alone again. Not out there. Not anywhere. It had been nearly a year since my ex-wife, Amanda, passed away. We had been divorced for 3 years before she died, and by then we had barely spoken. But when I got the news, it still hit me harder than I expected. I never thought I'd care so much, but grief has a way of creeping up on you when you least expect it. At first, I kept myself busy with work. I stuck to my routine, waking up early, going to the office, coming home, eating dinner alone, and falling asleep in front of the TV. It was a dull, predictable life, but it kept my mind from wandering too much. Then one evening, after a long day at work, I found myself sitting on the couch, staring at the framed picture of me and Amanda from when we were still together. We had taken a trip to the mountains, spent a week camping in a secluded area, and I remember thinking back then that it was one of the best times of my life. That's when I decided to go camping again. Not to relive memories with her, not to chase some ghost of the past, but because I needed to get away. I needed space, fresh air, something different from the routine I had trapped myself in. I packed up my gear, checked the forecast, and drove out to a remote part of the woods in northern Montana. I had been there once before, years ago, but never deep enough into the wilderness to be completely alone. This time, I wanted solitude. The drive was long, nearly 6 hours from my home. The further I got from the city, the more the roads turned into winding paths, flanked by dense forests on both sides. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the campsite, the sun was beginning to set. I parked my truck at the edge of a clearing, grabbed my backpack, and set off into the woods. I wanted to be far enough from any trail or main road so that I wouldn't hear another soul. I walked for nearly an hour before I found the perfect spot. A small clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. Setting up camp was easy. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and lit a fire as the sky darkened. Sitting by the flames, I felt more at peace than I had in months. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the distant rustling of leaves as the wind passed through the trees. I didn't expect to feel so comfortable, but that comfort didn't last long. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. The woods at night were alive with noises. I had camped before, but never this deep into the wilderness, never this far from other people. Every snap of a twig made my ears perk up. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to something moving outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just the sound of light footsteps, moving slowly, carefully. I held my breath, listening. My mind raced with possibilities. It could be a deer, a raccoon, maybe even a coyote. I reached for the flashlight next to me, but before I could turn it on, the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I waited, listening, but there was nothing. No movement, no wind, no insects, just dead silence. I stayed awake for what felt like hours before exhaustion finally took over. The morning brought back a sense of normalcy. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds chirped, and the stream nearby flowed steadily. I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the sounds from the night before. I spent the day hiking. I followed the stream deeper into the forest, climbed a rocky hill to get a better view, and even fished for a bit. For the first time in a while, I felt okay. But as I made my way back to camp in the afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, leading up to my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw no one. I told myself it had to be a hunter passing through. That made sense, right? Someone probably saw my camp, got curious, and left. I shook it off, made a fire, and forced myself to relax. That night, I woke up again. This time, the footsteps were closer, not just near my tent. Asterisk, asterisk, right outside. Asterisk, asterisk, I lay there, heart pounding, listening as the slow, deliberate steps circled my tent. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. A long, dreadful silence. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then, asterisk, asterisk, the zipper of my tent moved. Asterisk, asterisk, someone was trying to open it. I reacted immediately, grabbing the zipper from the inside and yanking it shut. At the same time, I shouted as loud as I could. Not words, just noise, an attempt to scare off whoever was out there. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, I heard rapid footsteps running into the woods. I waited, listening. The footsteps faded into the distance, swallowed by the forest. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I wanted to leave. I packed my things the moment the sun rose. But as I was stuffing my sleeping bag into my backpack, something caught my eye. Something lying just outside my tent. A knife. A hunting knife, old and rusted, lying on the ground as if someone had dropped it there. That was it. That was enough. I grabbed my gear, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started hiking back toward my truck. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt something. Presence. I reached my truck just as the sun was fully up. I threw my gear into the back, got in, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked into my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw him. A man standing just at the tree line. Not moving, not hiding, just standing there watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a gas station miles away from the woods. I never reported it. What would I say? That some stranger watched me in the woods? That he left a knife outside my tent? There was no crime, no proof, nothing but my fear. But I never went camping alone again. And sometimes, late at night, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys the quiet of the outdoors. I work a desk job in a city that never slows down, so anytime I get the chance to step away, I take it. The last few years, I've gotten into solo camping. Long, isolated trips into deep forests, places where I don't have to hear car horns or office phones ringing. This trip was supposed to be no different. I had planned it for months, setting aside a full week to explore a remote stretch of wilderness in Montana. The area was perfect. Miles away from civilization, dense with old trees, quiet rivers, and long, winding trails that barely saw any foot traffic. I drove out early in the morning, my truck packed with everything I'd need: food, a tent, sleeping bag, a small hatchet, a hunting knife, and my rifle, a .308 bolt action I always carried on solo trips. I had enough supplies to last me well over a week, just in case. The first 2 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. The weather was perfect, and I didn't see another soul. At night, the only sounds were the wind in the trees, the occasional rustling of small animals in the brush, and the distant howl of coyotes. It was peaceful, but that peace didn't last. On the third night, something changed. That evening, I set up camp in a small clearing near a river. The sun had just dipped below the treetops, and the sky was a deep shade of orange. I had already gathered enough firewood for the night and was heating up a can of chili over the flames when I heard it. Something moving in the trees behind me. First, I assumed it was just a deer, but then I noticed how slow and deliberate the movements were. Not the quick, cautious steps of an animal, but something different. I turned my head, scanning the tree line, but I couldn't see anything. Then, everything went silent. Anyone who spends time outdoors knows that the forest is never truly quiet. There's always the hum of insects, the distant calls of birds, the rustling of leaves. But now it was like the whole world had stopped. Even the wind had died down. A heavy feeling settled in my chest. Something was wrong. I grabbed my rifle and stood up slowly, listening. My fire crackled behind me, casting long shadows through the trees. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone silent, the sounds of the forest returned. Crickets chirped. The wind picked up. Everything was normal again. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a large animal had passed through, startling the smaller creatures into silence. That was all. I forced myself to sit back down and eat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area around my camp. I followed the river upstream for about an hour before looping back through the trees. That's when I saw them. Tracks. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft dirt, leading from the woods directly toward my camp. I crouched down, my stomach twisting. They looked human, barefoot, but something about them was off. The toes were too long, almost claw-like, and the stride was unnatural, too long, like whatever had made them had been running on all fours before standing upright. I followed them with my eyes, tracing their path. They stopped just a few feet from where my tent had been, then turned back into the trees. Something had been watching me last night. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. I suddenly felt very exposed. I gripped my rifle tighter and scanned the woods around me, but nothing moved. I told myself it was some kind of animal, maybe a bear with a weird gait. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had come out here for a full week, and I wasn't about to let my imagination cut my trip short. So I stayed. I should have left. That night, I built my fire bigger than usual. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway and groan. It wasn't raining, but the air felt damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth. I sat with my rifle across my lap, staring into the flames, trying not to let my mind wander. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes, just beyond the firelight. They were low to the ground, reflecting the light like an animal's, but they were too far apart, too high off the ground. They didn't blink, they just stared. I tightened my grip on my rifle, my breath shallow. Then they moved, not forward but sideways, circling me. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering. I raised my rifle, aiming just past the fire. I couldn't see anything except those eyes, gliding through the darkness like they were floating. And then they were gone. The forest went silent again. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I packed up. I was done. I didn't care if I was cutting my trip short. Something was out there, and I didn't want to find out what it was. I started hiking back toward my truck, moving fast. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear something, a rustle, a snap. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Then, about an hour from my truck, I heard it, my own voice. It was coming from the trees ahead of me. At first, I thought I was losing my mind, but then I heard it again. Sounded like me, but wrong. The words were stretched, broken, like someone had recorded my voice and was playing it back at the wrong speed. Hey! It was distant, flat. Then, closer, hey! I gripped my rifle and backed away. The voice came again, from my left this time. Help! Then, from behind me, hey! It was everywhere. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I threw my gear in, started the engine, and tore down that dirt road faster than I ever had before. As I drove, I saw movement in the trees. A figure, tall and thin, running alongside my truck. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending wrong. It moved like a puppet with its strings cut. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, It veered into the woods and disappeared. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. I haven't been back to that area since. I still go camping, but never alone. Never that deep into the wilderness. Sometimes at night, I think about those eyes in the trees, the tracks around my camp, the voice calling out from the darkness, and I wonder if it ever really stopped following me. Camping had always been my way of getting away from things. I wasn't the type to sit in a hotel or plan every little detail of a trip. I liked being out there in nature, away from the crowds where I could think clearly. I had done it plenty of times, mostly in the UK, but this time I wanted a change. A friend had told me about a place in France, somewhere deep in the countryside, away from tourists, where you could set up a tent and spend a few nights in peace. That was exactly what I needed. It was late September, just cool enough to be comfortable but not freezing at night. I packed light, just a tent, sleeping bag, food, a flashlight, and a knife, which I always carried when camping. Not for protection, really, just for cutting wood, cooking, things like that. I took my car across the channel and drove for hours, passing small villages and endless fields until I reached a wooded area that matched the description my friend had given me. The place was perfect. It was a dense forest, quiet except for the occasional sound of birds or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. There was no one else around. The nearest village was maybe 30 minutes away by car, and the nearest real road was just a dirt path leading into the trees. I parked my car a bit off the path and hiked in with my gear until I found a clearing by a small stream. That would be home for the next 2 nights. I set up my tent quickly and gathered some firewood before the sun dipped too low. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, listened to the sounds of the forest, and let myself relax. I hadn't realized how much I needed this. No stress, no people, just the quiet. The second day, I decided to explore the area a bit. I hiked through the trees, following the stream, and eventually came across an old wooden structure. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. A small cabin, barely standing, with rotting wood and a collapsed roof. I didn't go inside. There was no reason to, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't just that it looked unstable. It felt like someone had been there recently. There were footprints in the dirt near the entrance, and the door was slightly open, swinging just a little in the breeze. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing, just the wind in the trees. Maybe someone had come by recently, maybe another camper or a hunter. I left it alone and walked back to my campsite, shaking off the feeling. That night, things changed. I had my fire going, eating my dinner, when I noticed something. A sound. Footsteps. Not animals. Animals move differently, lighter, quicker. These were slow, deliberate. Someone was walking through the trees nearby. I turned off my flashlight and sat still, listening. The fire crackled beside me, but I heard it clearly. Footsteps circling my camp. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping my knife, trying to make sense of it. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, heart pounding. Nothing happened for a long time. No movement, no sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there, watching. Eventually, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just an animal after all, or my imagination getting the best of me. I forced myself to lie down in my tent, keeping the knife close. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise made me jolt awake, but nothing happened. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints, deep in the dirt, circling my tent. Someone had been there, watching me while I slept. I packed my things in record time. I didn't want to stay another night, but as I walked back to my car, I had the horrible feeling that I wasn't alone. The whole way, I felt eyes on me, hidden behind the trees. I never saw anyone, never heard another sound, but I knew someone had been there, and they had been close. I never went back. I don't know why I thought camping alone in a place like that was a good idea. I had done plenty of solo camping trips before, but this one was different. It wasn't some maintained campground with picnic tables and fire pits. This was deep in the woods, miles away from any town, in a spot I had picked out using a topographic map. The place seemed perfect on paper, far from any roads, near a small creek, and surrounded by thick forest. I wanted quiet. I wanted to disconnect from everything. What I got instead was a night that I still try not to think about. I drove as far as the logging roads would take me, then parked and hiked another few miles in with my pack. It was late afternoon when I reached the spot. The trees were tall and dense, the ground thick with fallen leaves and moss. The creek was just as I had expected, a narrow stream of clear water cutting through the land. It was the perfect spot until it wasn't. I pitched my small one-person tent on a flat patch of ground and gathered firewood. The woods were quiet, aside from the occasional bird call or rustling in the undergrowth. Nothing unusual, nothing that made me feel unsafe. As the sun started setting, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. I ate while listening to the sounds of the forest. I remember feeling completely at peace, staring into the flames as the sky darkened above me. That peace didn't last. It started with a feeling, a sense that something was off. At first, I ignored it. I was alone, deep in the woods. Of course, it would feel a little unnerving. But the longer I sat by the fire, the stronger it got. A tightness in my chest, the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the branches overhead. It sounded like whispering. I told myself it was just my imagination. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark. I forced myself to stay by the fire, to push the feeling aside. Then I heard it, a twig snapping, not the random sound of a branch falling from a tree. This was deliberate, the sound of something or someone stepping on it. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I saw nothing. The fire crackled, the wind whispered, but beyond that, the woods had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. I tried to brush it off. Probably an animal, a deer maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay by the fire for a while longer, but I couldn't relax. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, a shift in the darkness. Eventually, I decided to turn in. I banked the fire so it would last through the night, then crawled into my tent. I left the rain fly off so I could see the stars through the mesh. I lay there listening. The wind, the creaking trees, the occasional crack of cooling wood from the fire. Then something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, not the scurry of a small animal. Heavier. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Minutes passed. Then, just as I started to convince myself I had imagined it, I heard it again. Closer. Couldn't just lie there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly in my hand. I listened for what felt like hours, every nerve in my body on edge. At some point, exhaustion took over. I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of something moving right outside my tent. Not walking, breathing, a slow, deep inhale. I stopped breathing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow. The woods were still silent. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. No footsteps, no retreating noise, just gone. I lay awake until dawn. As soon as the first light filtered through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The fire was cold, The air was damp. I scanned the area. Nothing looked out of place. No tracks, no signs that anything or anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up my gear quickly, my skin crawling the entire time. I had planned to stay another night, but there was no way I was spending another second out there. I hiked back to my car in record time. The entire way, I felt like something was following me. I never saw anything, but the feeling never went away. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. I sat there for a long moment, just breathing. I haven't been back to that place since. I don't plan to. Whatever was out there that night, I don't want to know. I had been planning a solo camping trip for months. It wasn't my first time heading out alone into the woods, and I felt confident about my experience. I had all my gear, a good understanding of the terrain, and I wasn't the type to take risks. The location I picked this time was a national forest in Montana, somewhere far enough from civilization that I wouldn't see another person for miles, but not so deep that I'd be completely cut off. I had a solid GPS, plenty of food, and enough knowledge of the area to know what I was doing. I had camped alone before, and I liked the quiet. The first day went by without much trouble. I parked my truck at a designated camping area, then hiked out several miles to a secluded spot near a small river. It was early fall, so the days were still warm, but the nights were cold. The trees were starting to change color, and the crisp air made everything feel fresh. I found a good clearing and set up my tent, making sure I was on flat ground and away from any dead trees that could fall. I collected firewood, checked my gear, and set up a small fire as the sun went down. It was peaceful. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the occasional splash from the river. That night, I slept well, only waking up a few times when I heard distant animal noises, normal for the wilderness. I had my bear canister secured away from my camp and a knife within reach, but I never had any real concerns. The next day, I spent my time hiking around, gathering more firewood, and just enjoying being alone. It was the kind of trip I had been looking forward to for a long time, until things started to feel off. That evening, as I was preparing to cook dinner, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. First, I brushed it off. I hadn't seen a single person since I left my truck, and I was miles from the nearest road. But the feeling wouldn't go away. As I ate my food, I kept looking over my shoulder. The trees were thick and the undergrowth was dense. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, something made me uneasy. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise outside the tent made me tense up. I kept telling myself it was just the forest. Small animals moving through the brush, the wind shifting the trees. But there were moments when the noises didn't feel random. It was like someone or something was moving with purpose. At one point, I was almost asleep when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps just outside my tent. Not the light scurrying of a raccoon or the heavy movement of a deer. These were human steps. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I listened, straining to hear past the sound of my own breathing. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a soft rustling, like someone shifting their weight. I wanted to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew better. Someone was out there. Minutes passed. The footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just paranoia, and I must have imagined it. Still, I kept my knife close and barely slept. The next morning, I checked around my camp, looking for any sign that someone had been there. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then, near the edge of my camp, I saw it. A single boot print in the dirt. It wasn't mine. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't seen anyone for miles. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. I packed up my gear quickly, deciding to cut my trip short. I wasn't about to stick around and see who else might be out there. As I hiked back toward my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound made my nerves jump. The feeling of being watched never went away. When I finally reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief. But as I loaded my gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the dirt near my truck, were more footprints. They weren't mine. They hadn't been there when I arrived. Someone had been waiting. I didn't stick around to find out who. I got in my truck, locked the doors, and drove out of there as fast as I could. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never will be again. I remember the camping trip with my gym partner like it happened yesterday. It was late autumn, a time when the days were shorter, the air was crisp, and the forests had an eerie stillness. We had planned the trip weeks in advance, choosing a remote area in the mountains where we could test our endurance, push our limits, and escape from the constant noise of everyday life. We weren't just gym partners. We were friends who thrived on competition, always challenging each other to lift heavier, run faster, and go further than before. This trip was supposed to be another test of strength, physically and mentally. We had chosen a spot deep in the wilderness, a place far from the crowded campgrounds and tourist trails. The plan was to hike for a full day into the backcountry, set up camp, and spend a few days in total isolation. No cell service, no distractions, just nature, survival, and the challenge of roughing it out. It seemed like the perfect plan. The first day of hiking went well. The trail was steep, winding through thick forest, with leaves crunching beneath our boots. The higher we climbed, the colder the air became. We had packed light but brought the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, enough food for a few days, and basic survival gear. Both of us were in excellent shape, but by the time the sun started to dip behind the mountains, we were exhausted. We found a clearing near a small stream and decided to set up camp. That night, the forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no sounds of crickets, no rustling of leaves from small animals, just silence, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. We ate in silence, both of us too tired to talk much, and eventually crawled into our tents. The exhaustion from the hike took over, and I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I realized I could hear something moving outside. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. At first, I thought it was my gym partner shifting in his tent, but then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Someone, or something, was walking around our campsite. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps weren't random. They moved in a slow, deliberate pattern, circling our tents. I wanted to call out to my gym partner, but something stopped me. An instinct, maybe, a feeling that I shouldn't make a sound. I stayed as still as possible, straining to hear. The footsteps continued, circling, pausing, then moving again. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I lay awake for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I didn't say anything at first. Maybe it had just been an animal, maybe I had imagined it. But when I stepped outside my tent, I saw my gym partner already awake, staring at the ground. There were footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They weren't ours. They were fresh, and they circled around our tents multiple times before disappearing into the trees. Neither of us said anything for a long time. We just stood there, staring at the tracks. Finally, we packed up our gear and decided to move deeper into the forest. Maybe it had been another camper, lost or curious. Maybe it had been a hunter, but something about those tracks felt wrong. There was no reason for someone to walk around our camp like that in the middle of the night. We hiked for most of the day, putting as much distance between us and the previous campsite as possible. By late afternoon, we found another clearing near a river and set up camp again. The feeling of unease from the morning had started to fade. Maybe we had overreacted. Maybe it was nothing. That night, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of movement outside the tent. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. I felt my heart pound in my chest as I listened. The sound was closer this time, much closer. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A deep, slow breath, right outside my tent. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The fabric of the tent was thin, and I could feel the presence of something just beyond it. My mind raced. Should I grab my knife? Should I make a noise? Should I stay silent? The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, slowly, disappearing into the night. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out of my tent, my body still shaking from fear. My gym partner was already up, his face pale. He didn't have to say anything. I knew he had heard it too. We didn't waste any time. We packed our gear as fast as possible and started hiking back. We didn't talk much. There was nothing to say. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone following us. By the time we made it back to the car, the sun was already setting. We threw our gear in the back and got in without a word. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the tree line, watching us. But there was nothing. We never went back to that place again. We never talked about what happened. But to this day, I still wonder who was out there in the woods with us, and what would have happened if we had stayed one more night. I've always been the kind of person who likes being out in nature. Camping was my way of getting away from everything: work, stress, the noise of life. I wasn't an expert outdoorsman or anything, but I knew my way around the basics. I had a routine. I'd pack up, head out to the woods for a few days, clear my mind, and come back feeling better. That was the plan this time, too. It was early October, cool but not too cold, perfect weather for a solo camping trip. I picked a spot in a national forest in Montana, one of those places that didn't get too much foot traffic. I wasn't looking for crowded campgrounds or hiking trails packed with people. I wanted quiet, just me, my tent, my gear, and the trees. The drive out was long, about 4 hours from my home. I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a good knife, my rifle. Not because I expected trouble, but because it was stupid to go deep into the woods without one. Bears, mountain lions, even just a coyote getting too curious. I liked having a way to protect myself. I parked at a trailhead and started hiking in, aiming to go about 5 miles before setting up camp. The deeper I got, the quieter everything became. No cars, no voices, just the wind in the trees and the occasional sound of an animal moving through the brush. By the time I found a good spot, it was late afternoon. I chose a small clearing near a stream, set up my tent, and got a fire going. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was peaceful. That first night was uneventful. I ate, sat by the fire for a while, then turned in early. I slept fine, woke up with the sunrise, and spent the day exploring. Walked a few miles, found some animal tracks, even spotted a few deer. It was exactly the kind of trip I wanted. Then, that second night, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. I was sitting by the fire when I heard movement in the trees behind me. Not unusual, The woods are full of animals, but this sounded bigger. Not a deer, though. It was slower, more deliberate, like something was stepping carefully. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing, just the usual tangle of branches and leaves. I brushed it off, told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like I wasn't alone anymore, like something was watching me. I tried to shake it off, ate my dinner, sat by the fire, but I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder. Every little noise made my skin crawl. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening. At some point in the night, I heard it again, a twig snapping, then another, not close but not far either. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining my ears. Nothing. I lay there for what felt like hours, heart pounding, before finally drifting off again. The next morning, I told myself I was being paranoid. That's what being alone in the woods does to you. It makes your brain jump at every little sound. I decided to stay one more night. I shouldn't have. That day, I hiked out farther than before, trying to clear my head, but something felt wrong. The deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen, and once or twice, I swore I heard something. Footsteps stopping just after mine, the faintest rustling in the trees. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the woods, just my imagination. But when I made it back to camp that evening, something was different. My tent was open, not torn, not wrecked, just open, the zipper halfway down. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't left it like that. I was careful about keeping it shut to keep bugs and animals out. I walked over, heart pounding, and checked inside. Nothing was missing. My sleeping bag was still there. My food, my gear untouched. But someone had been here, or something. I stood there for a long time trying to decide what to do. Pack up and leave? Stay one more night? I had my rifle. I wasn't defenseless. I decided to stay. I shouldn't have. That night, I built my fire bigger than before. I sat closer to it, rifle within arm's reach. I wasn't letting my guard down this time. And sure enough, not long after the sun went down, I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not a deer. Not a bear. Something walking. Slow. Careful. Close. I gripped my rifle, staring into the dark, but my fire only lit up so much. I couldn't see beyond the first few rows of trees. Then silence. I don't know what was worse, the sound or the way it just stopped. I stayed up for hours watching, listening. The woods felt different, heavier. The air felt thick, like something was pressing in on me. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. Then, in the dead of night, I woke up. Not to a noise, to silence. The fire had burned low. The woods were too quiet. No wind. No insects. Nothing. And then, just outside the glow of the fire, ***, movement ***. A shadow, tall, human-shaped, standing between the trees. I went still, barely breathing. My hands clenched around my rifle. The shadow didn't move, just stood there, watching. Then it took a step forward. That broke me. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around, and aimed. My finger rested on the trigger. Move, I thought. Move, and I swear to God. The shadow stepped back. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep after that. Didn't move. Just sat there waiting for morning. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up. Fast. I didn't even eat. Just shoved everything in my bag and started hiking. The whole way back to my truck, I felt it. That pressure. That feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I swore I heard footsteps behind me, but I never turned around. I just kept walking. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was home. I don't know who or what I saw that night. Person? Maybe. But what kind of person stands in the dark, watching without saying a word? I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again. That was one of the scariest things that ever happened to me. I don't tell the story often because most people don't believe me, but I know what I saw, and I know I was not alone in those woods. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I was just trying to prove something to myself. Maybe I thought it would be a good story to tell later, a way to make my life feel less routine. I never really believed in anything supernatural, but I've always had this deep respect for places that hold history, especially the kind of history that most people don't want to think about. Graveyards fall into that category. It started with a simple idea: camp overnight in an old graveyard just outside of town. It wasn't one of those well-kept cemeteries with trimmed grass and neat little rows of stones. This one was different. It sat on the edge of a small wooded area, long forgotten by anyone except the occasional vandal or unlucky passerby. The graves were old, the names on the stones barely visible under layers of moss and grime. Some of the headstones leaned at odd angles, their bases sinking into the earth over time. The last recorded burial had been decades ago, and by now, most people didn't even acknowledge that it existed. I packed light, a small tent, a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a knife. Not because I expected to need it, but because it felt stupid not to bring one. The hike out there was uneventful, just a long walk along an overgrown path that barely resembled a trail anymore. The further I got from the road, the quieter everything became. The air felt thicker, and the usual background noise of distant cars and buzzing streetlights disappeared entirely. By the time I reached the graveyard, the sun was starting to set. The last bit of light cast long shadows across the uneven ground, making the headstones look even more twisted and misshapen than they already were. I set up my tent near the edge of the cemetery, close to the trees. I didn't want to sleep directly among the graves. Even if I didn't believe in anything supernatural, it just felt wrong. As night settled in, the temperature dropped fast. I zipped up my jacket and sat just outside my tent, listening. The forest was alive with small sounds, branches creaking, leaves rustling, the occasional chirp of some night insect. But the graveyard itself felt silent, unnaturally so. No wind moved through the trees, no animals scurried through the underbrush. It was just still. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, and checked my phone. No service. Not surprising, but still annoying. I put it away and decided to walk around a little before turning in for the night. My flashlight beam swept over the graves, revealing names and dates long past relevance. Some of the stones had crumbled into little more than piles of rock. Others still stood, their inscriptions barely legible. I came across one that caught my eye. It was a simple stone, not very large, but something about it seemed off. The dirt around it looked disturbed, not fresh, but like it had been moved at some point and never fully settled back into place. I crouched down, running my fingers over the loose soil. Probably just an animal digging, I told myself, but it didn't look like the kind of hole an animal would make. It looked like someone had tried to dig something up. The thought sat heavy in my mind as I made my way back to my tent. I zipped myself inside, clicked off my flashlight, and lay down. The silence pressed in from all sides. Every tiny sound felt amplified, like the whole world had gone still except for whatever was out there, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly, my body on high alert. Something had changed. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound. Not from the woods, not from the road, from the graveyard. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay still, straining to hear more. The sound wasn't steady. It came in short bursts, like someone taking a few slow steps, stopping, then moving again. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle tightly. Then silence. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. Minutes passed. Nothing. Just when I started convincing myself that I had imagined it, a new sound cut through the quiet. A sharp, distinct thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. It was close, too close. I forced myself to move, slowly unzipping my tent just enough to peek outside. My flashlight was in my other hand, ready to flick on the second I needed it. I scanned the graveyard, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Nothing. Then I saw it. A grave, one I hadn't noticed before, with a wooden marker instead of stone. The dirt around it had been disturbed, the same way as the one I saw earlier. But this time it was worse. The ground had been pushed up from below. My stomach dropped. Something had been dug up, or something had dug itself out. I don't remember making the decision to move, but I was suddenly out of my tent, gripping my flashlight with one hand and my knife with the other. My breath came fast, my ears ringing with my own heartbeat. Then I saw the footprints, deep, fresh prints in the soft dirt, leading away from the disturbed grave, leading toward the trees, toward my tent. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the area with my flashlight. Nothing moved, but I knew I wasn't alone. A snapping sound came from the tree line. I spun toward it, shining my light into the woods. For a split second, I saw something. Not clearly, just the faintest hint of movement, something shifting in the shadows. Then it was gone. That was enough for me. I didn't bother packing up my tent. I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care what was behind me. I just needed to get out of there. By the time I reached the road, my legs felt like they would give out. I didn't stop until I was in my car, doors locked, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life and I drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if anything was watching me. The next day, I convinced myself that I had imagined most of it. Sleep deprivation, paranoia, tricks of the light. But something still didn't sit right. A week later, I went back in the daylight. Not alone this time. I brought a friend, someone I trusted. We found the grave I had seen that night. The wooden marker was still there. The disturbed dirt was still there. But the footprints were gone. And the grave, it was filled back in, like nothing had ever happened. I haven't gone back since. I was looking for somewhere quiet, away from the city. Work had been draining me, and I wanted to clear my head. I had a friend, Daniel, who owned a farm out in the countryside. It wasn't a big commercial farm, just some land his family had kept for generations. He didn't live there full-time, but he visited on weekends to keep it maintained. When I mentioned wanting to camp somewhere peaceful, he offered me a spot on his land. "It's quiet out there," he had said. "No traffic, no noise, just fields and trees." That was exactly what I wanted. The farm was in a rural part of Pennsylvania, about a 3-hour drive from my place. It had been in Daniel's family for years, but they didn't do much with it anymore. His grandfather had raised cattle there, but after he passed, the family slowly let the farming go. Now it was mostly empty fields, a few wooded patches, and an old barn that was falling apart. There was a small cabin on the land, but I wanted to camp out in the open. I packed light, just a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and my knife. I liked the idea of being away from everything for a few nights, just me and nature. I arrived in the late afternoon. The dirt road leading to the farm was rough, with weeds growing between the tire tracks. There was no proper driveway, just a path that cut through the fields. The land stretched for miles, Nothing but tall grass and scattered trees. The barn was the first thing I saw. It was old, leaning slightly to one side. The wood was gray from years of sun and rain. Near it was the small cabin, barely more than a shed. Daniel had told me it was still sturdy, but I didn't plan to stay inside. I parked near the barn and walked the property. The air smelled like damp earth. The fields were overgrown, the grass reaching my waist in some places. There were no animals, no livestock, just the quiet rustling of the wind. I picked a spot near the edge of the property, where a patch of trees created a natural barrier from the road. Felt secluded, hidden. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and ate a quick meal. The sun was starting to set, the sky turning orange and pink. As night fell, the silence settled in. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the occasional chirp of crickets. It was peaceful. I stayed by the fire for a while, watching the flames dance. After a while, I crawled into my tent and lay down. Then I heard it, a rustling noise, not the wind, something moving through the grass. I held my breath, listening. It was faint but steady. Slow steps. Something or someone was walking nearby. I sat up, my hand reaching for my knife. My fire had burned low, casting only a weak glow. I listened. The sound stopped. I stayed still, straining my ears. Nothing, just the breeze through the trees. Maybe an animal, a deer maybe. I lay back down, but I kept my knife close. The silence felt different now, heavier. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to another noise. This time it was closer. Footsteps, right outside my tent. Not an animal. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps were soft, careful. Someone was walking just inches from where I lay. I gripped my knife. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The footsteps circled my tent. Slow, deliberate. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything but the wind. I slowly sat up, my hand shaking around the knife. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Darkness. I scanned the area. My fire was just glowing embers now. The trees stood still. Nothing moved, but I felt it. I wasn't alone. I stepped out slowly, knife in hand. The air was cold against my skin. I turned, looking in every direction. Then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the tall grass to my tent. Human footprints. They circled my tent twice, then disappeared back into the field. Someone had been here, watching me. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the darkness. Nothing. I listened for any sound, but there was only the wind. I backed toward my tent, never taking my eyes off the field. My mind raced. Should I pack up and leave? But where would I go? The nearest town was miles away. I couldn't just sit in my tent and wait. I made a decision. I would stay up until sunrise. Whatever was out there, I wouldn't give it a chance to catch me off guard. I added more wood to the fire, letting the flames grow. The light felt like protection. I sat with my knife in my lap, staring into the dark. The night stretched on. I didn't hear any more footsteps, but I never felt alone. Finally, the sky began to lighten, the first signs of dawn. I forced myself to wait until the sun was fully up before stepping away from the fire. I checked the ground again. The footprints were still there, and something else. A set of footprints leading back toward the barn. Whoever it was had been hiding on the property. I needed to leave. I packed up quickly, throwing everything into my truck. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the barn. The door was open. It had been closed when I arrived. I didn't check inside. I didn't want to know. I got into my truck and left, driving fast down the dirt road. I never went back. A week later, Daniel called me. "Did you see anything weird out there?" he asked. I hesitated. Why? Someone broke into the cabin. Didn't take anything, just stayed there. Found a sleeping bag inside. Some empty food cans. I swallowed hard. When? Don't know. Could have been recent. Could have been there for weeks. I didn't say anything. Maybe next time, Daniel said. Pick a different place to camp. I didn't need to be told twice. I never went back to that farm. I don't know why I agreed to that trip. Maybe it was the constant pressure at work, the same dull routine every day, the sound of ringing phones and clicking keyboards echoing in my head even when I was home. I thought a break would help. A weekend away with the team. No work, no customers, just nature. It was late September, the kind of weather where the air had a bite to it at night, but during the day you could still feel the leftover warmth of summer. Someone from the office, maybe Mike or Daniel, I can't remember now, had suggested we go camping. A bonding trip, they called it. Most of the team was on board. Even the branch manager, Robert, decided to come along. We were a mix of people. Some young, some older, all just looking to get away from the constant stress of balancing accounts and handling impatient customers. We decided on a spot a few hours outside the city, a camping area near a forest. It wasn't one of those designated campsites with facilities and marked trails. It was more remote. Someone knew someone who had been there before, said it was a great place, peaceful. We packed up our gear, loaded into cars, and headed out on a Friday evening. By the time we arrived, the sun was already low in the sky. The drive had been long, the last stretch on rough, uneven roads. We parked on a small clearing off the road and walked the rest of the way with our backpacks. The forest was dense, dark even before the sun had fully set. Tall trees, thick undergrowth, no sign of other people around. Setting up camp took longer than expected. The ground was hard, and the air was getting colder. Someone struggled with the tents. Another person fumbled with the firewood. There was a lot of laughing, some frustration, but we managed. The fire was finally lit, flickering shadows dancing across the trees. We sat around, eating, drinking, unwinding from the week. Stories were shared. Some funny, some about work, a few about past camping trips. The sounds of the forest were all around us. Crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional distant call of an animal. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. I didn't notice it at first. Maybe it was just the unease of being so far from civilization, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. The darkness beyond the fire felt heavier than it should have. The trees seemed too still. At some point, Robert got up to grab something from his tent. A minute passed, then another. Someone made a joke about him getting lost. More time went by. Should we check on him? Someone finally said. I stood up, shined my flashlight toward the tents. Robert. No response. I walked toward his tent, the leaves crunching beneath my boots. The flap was unzipped, hanging open. His bag was there, half unpacked. But he wasn't. A few of us spread out, calling his name, scanning the area with flashlights. The forest swallowed our voices. I told myself he must have just wandered off to relieve himself. He'd be back, but he wasn't. Minutes passed, stretching into half an hour. The mood shifted. The laughter and easy conversation from earlier were gone. We weren't just a group of co-workers anymore. We were a group of people suddenly realizing how alone we were out there. We split up into pairs, flashlights cutting through the dark. I was with Daniel, walking along a narrow trail near the trees. The deeper we went, the more the forest felt wrong. The air was too still, the usual sounds of nighttime animals absent. Every snap of a branch underfoot made me flinch. And then we found it. Not Robert, but something. A backpack. Not his, someone else's. It looked old, weathered, left behind. I crouched down, shined my light over it. The fabric was torn in places. There was dirt on it, dried mud. I unzipped it carefully, half expecting to find, I don't even know. Inside, there were a few crumpled clothes, a rusted canteen, an old flashlight, but no sign of who it belonged to. Daniel muttered something under his breath. He was staring at the trees, his face pale. I followed his gaze. There, nailed into the bark of a tree, was a shirt. Not just hung there, but nailed. The fabric was shredded, faded with time. It looked like it had been there for years. We backed away fast. We weren't alone out there. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. We weren't alone. We rushed back to the campsite, breathless. The others could see it on our faces. Something was wrong. Then, from the other side of the camp, someone shouted. Another one of us, Laura, had found something. A shoe. Robert's shoe. Not far from it, the ground was disturbed. Grass flattened, dirt kicked up, like there had been a struggle. I don't remember who said it first. We need to leave, but we didn't know where to go. The cars were a long walk back. The forest was thick, the trails winding. And if Robert was still out there, could we just leave him? No one wanted to say it, but we all thought the same thing. He wasn't coming back. Not in the way we wanted. The night stretched on. We stayed close to the fire, flashlights in hand, listening. Every sound made my heart race. The snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Was it the wind, an animal, or something else? At some point, exhaustion took over. Some of us dozed off in shifts while the rest kept watch. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light crept through the trees, we packed up faster than I thought possible. No one spoke much. No one wanted to be the last one left behind. We hiked back to the cars in tense silence, glancing over our shoulders, half expecting to see something following us. But we never did. We reported Robert missing. The search teams went out, combed the area for days. They never found him.
No trace.
No body. Nothing. Just a campsite abandoned in a forest that felt too quiet. I haven't gone camping since. I always loved hunting. It wasn't just about the kill. It was about the silence, the patience, the way the forest swallowed me whole. I grew up with a rifle in my hands, learning from my father and uncles, spending more time in the woods than in my own house. There was a comfort to it, a feeling of control in an otherwise chaotic life. That's why, when I finally got a week off work, I packed my gear and drove out to a spot I'd been meaning to hunt for years. It was deep in the woods, a few hours from the nearest town, just past a series of old logging trails that most people had forgotten about. I had heard from an old friend that the deer population was good out there, and best of all, no other hunters. Just me, my rifle, and the wilderness. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping below the trees. The air smelled like damp leaves and fresh pine, and the wind had a sharp edge to it, the kind that told me the temperature would drop fast once night came. I parked my truck at the end of the trail, strapped on my pack, and hiked in about a mile until I found a good clearing to set up camp. The first thing I did was get my tent up. I always brought a sturdy one, something that could handle the cold. I laid out my sleeping bag inside, then built a fire pit a few yards away. Once that was done, I pulled my rifle from its case, checked the scope, and made sure everything was ready for the morning hunt. As the fire crackled, I sat on a log, eating a quick meal of jerky and trail mix. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Normally, I'd hear the distant call of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, maybe even the howl of a coyote. But that night, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes the forest just had an eerie stillness to it. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and fell asleep within minutes. I woke up before sunrise, as I always did when hunting. The air inside the tent was freezing, and when I stepped outside, my breath hung in thick clouds. I made a quick cup of coffee on my small camp stove, ate a protein bar, and then grabbed my rifle. The plan was simple: find a good spot, set up, and wait. I moved through the trees as quietly as I could, keeping my steps light, watching for any movement. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frost, and every step made a soft crunching sound. About 30 minutes in, I found a good spot near a small clearing. I settled in behind some brush, using it as cover, and waited. An hour passed, then two. Nothing. It was strange. Normally, by now, I would have at least seen movement. But the woods were still. No birds, no squirrels, no deer. Just the wind. I stayed put for another hour before finally giving up. I stood, stretched, and decided to head deeper into the woods. Maybe they were further in. As I moved, I started to feel off, like I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I'd spent too much time in the woods for that. This was different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my gut told me something wasn't right. I stopped and listened. Nothing, just the wind. I pushed forward, forcing myself to ignore it. Then I found the tracks. At first, I thought they were from a deer, but as I knelt down, I realized they were different. Larger, heavier, and they weren't shaped like hooves, they looked like boots. Someone else was out here. That wasn't too strange on its own. Hunters sometimes wandered onto other people's spots, but what bothered me was that the tracks looked fresh, yet I hadn't heard a single shot all morning. I followed them. The tracks led me deeper into the woods, past an area I hadn't planned to go. Eventually, I saw something through the trees, a structure, a cabin. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd looked at before coming here, which was odd. It looked old, the wood dark and weathered, but it wasn't abandoned. There was a faint wisp of smoke coming from the chimney. I crouched low, watching. No movement. Something about it made me uneasy. The way it sat there, hidden deep in the woods, like it wasn't meant to be found. Then I saw something else. The tracks didn't just lead to the cabin. They circled it, multiple times. That's when I realized something was really wrong. These weren't just the tracks of someone heading to their cabin. They were the tracks of someone walking around it over and over, watching. I turned and left, moving quickly but quietly back the way I came. I didn't care about the hunt anymore. Something wasn't right here, and I wasn't about to find out the hard way. As I made my way back to camp, that feeling of being watched got stronger. Every few minutes, I stopped, turned, scanned the trees. Nothing, but I knew someone was there. I finally reached my camp and immediately started packing. I wasn't staying another night. As I threw my gear into my pack, I heard it, a branch snapping, close. I froze, my hand on my rifle. Slowly, I turned my head. Nothing, just the trees. I scanned the area for another minute before forcing myself to move. I slung my pack over my shoulder, grabbed my rifle, and started walking. I made it about 50 yards before I saw them. A figure, standing between the trees, half hidden in the shadows. They weren't moving, just standing, watching. I raised my rifle, not aiming, but making it clear I saw them. They didn't react. I took a step back. The figure shifted slightly, just enough for me to see their face. It was wrong. Their skin looked stretched too tight, their eyes wide, unblinking, and they were smiling. Not a normal smile, something else, something off. I turned and walked away, fast. I didn't run. I knew better than that. But I moved as quickly as I could without making it obvious I was panicking. I made it to my truck, threw my gear in the back, and climbed inside. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I put it in reverse, backing up onto the trail, then slammed it into drive and sped off. As I drove, I looked in the rearview mirror. The figure was standing at the edge of the trees, still watching, still smiling. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road, heading straight for town. I never went back to that spot, never tried to find out who or what I had seen. Some places aren't meant to be found, and some people aren't meant to be out there. I had been planning the trip for weeks, a solo camping trip deep into the woods of northern Montana. I wanted to be alone, to clear my head, to get away from work, from people, from everything. I wasn't new to this. I had camped all my life, grew up hunting, fishing, hiking. The wilderness was my second home, and I figured a few nights away would do me some good. I packed everything I needed: my tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a good knife, my rifle, extra ammo, a compass, a map, and a first aid kit. I kept my phone with me, though I knew there wouldn't be any service where I was going. I wanted the isolation. The deep woods had always given me peace, a place where the world felt simple again. The drive out was long, a mix of winding roads and dirt trails that eventually led me to an old, rarely used logging road. I followed it for miles until I reached a spot where I felt comfortable leaving my truck behind. There wasn't a soul in sight, just miles of thick forest and nothing else. That's exactly what I wanted. I grabbed my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The air was crisp, the smell of pine heavy in the air. I followed an old game trail, weaving my way deeper into the woods. I had studied the area on a map before coming. There was a stream about 3 miles in, a perfect place to set up camp. I reached it after about an hour. It was perfect. The stream was clear, flowing steady, a good source of water. The trees were thick, offering plenty of cover. I found a small clearing just off the bank and set up my tent. I took my time gathering firewood, making sure I had enough to last the night. I set up a perimeter, marked my surroundings. The first rule of solo camping is knowing your area, where your exits are, where the high ground is, what's around you. I had always been cautious, always aware. The first night was calm. I cooked some food over the fire, sat back, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the occasional rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful. I stayed up for a while, watching the fire, letting my thoughts drift. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I listened. Nothing. No wind, no insects, no movement. That wasn't normal. The forest never went silent like that unless something was wrong. I reached for my rifle, keeping it close as I sat up, scanning the darkness. My headlamp was in my pack, but I didn't want to use it yet. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, and I didn't want to lose that. I stayed still, listening. A few minutes passed, then a sound. It was faint, just a slight rustling, but it was close, maybe 20 feet away, just beyond the tree line. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the dark, but there was nothing. Could have been an animal, but the way the forest had gone quiet, I wasn't sure. I sat there for a long time, rifle in hand, waiting. The silence stretched on. Eventually, I heard the normal sounds of the woods again. The wind, the insects, the distant hoot of an owl. Whatever it was, it had moved on. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I checked the area. I found tracks near my camp. Fresh. Human. That wasn't right. I was miles from the nearest road, deep in the woods where no one should be. The tracks weren't mine. They were smaller, lighter. Someone had been near my camp, watching. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared into the thicker brush. I didn't like it. I had never run into another person this deep in the woods before. I decided to stay one more night, but I kept my rifle loaded and close. That day, I stayed near camp, keeping an eye on my surroundings. I didn't see anything out of place, but that feeling stuck with me, the sense that I wasn't alone out there. That night, I built the fire bigger, hoping it would keep anything or anyone away. But that didn't stop it from happening again. I woke up same as the night before. The fire was low, the woods silent. But this time I heard breathing. It was close, slow, steady breathing. Someone was standing just outside my tent. I gripped my rifle, my heart pounding. I listened. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps shifting on the dirt, the slow inhale and exhale of someone just beyond the thin layer of fabric separating me from the dark. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the breathing stopped. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps retreating, moving away from my tent. They were slow, careful. Whoever it was, they were trying not to make noise. I stayed like that for hours, rifle in my hands, listening to the forest. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. To first light, I packed up. I didn't eat, didn't take my time. I just packed everything, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and started walking back toward my truck. I moved fast, kept my head on a swivel. I checked my back every few steps. The feeling of being watched never went away. The whole way back, I never saw anyone. When I finally reached my truck, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I threw my gear into the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. I was ready to get the hell out of there. As I turned onto the logging road, I looked in my rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, not moving, just watching. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. I kept driving, putting as much distance between me and that place as I could. I never went back. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods. There was something about it. The quiet, the stillness, the feeling of being far away from everything. It was a way to clear my head, to get away from the noise of everyday life. I'd gone on solo camping trips plenty of times before, and I never thought twice about it. This time was no different. I had a weekend off, and I decided to take my gear and head out to a spot I had been to before, deep in the mountains. It wasn't a well-known campsite, just a clearing by a small river with a fire pit I had built myself on a previous trip. It was far enough from any towns that I didn't have to worry about running into people. That was the whole point. I packed up my truck on a Friday morning, making sure I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a knife, a hatchet, and my rifle. I wasn't a hunter, but I always brought it on trips like this. There were bears in the area, and I didn't want to take any chances. The drive took a few hours. Most of it was on paved roads, but the last stretch was a rough dirt path that wound up through the trees. I had to take it slow, steering carefully over rocks and ruts, but eventually, I made it to the clearing. It was just as I remembered. The river was running strong, and the trees were thick and green. There was no sign that anyone else had been there recently. No trash, no tracks, nothing. Perfect. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the river that I could hear the water, but far enough that I didn't have to worry about flooding. Then I gathered firewood, built a small fire, and cooked myself a meal. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, listened to the sounds of the forest, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. It got cold after the sun went down, but I had plenty of layers. I slept well. The next morning, I woke up early, made some coffee over the fire, and decided to go for a hike. There were miles of forest in every direction, and I liked exploring. I took my rifle with me, just in case, and set off into the trees. I walked for a few hours, not following any particular path, just wandering. I saw deer, birds, and a few old fallen trees covered in moss. Everything was normal until I found the footprints. They were fresh, too fresh. The dirt was still loose around the edges, like someone had stepped there just a little while ago. They weren't mine. They were bigger than my boots, and they went in a straight line through the trees. At first, I thought it might have been another camper, but that didn't make sense. There were no other campsites nearby, and the tracks didn't look like someone out for a hike. They were too direct, too purposeful. I followed them for a little while, but after a few minutes, I felt uneasy. Something about them didn't sit right with me. They were heading in the general direction of my campsite. I turned around and went back. When I got to my camp, nothing looked out of place. My tent was still zipped up. My firewood pile was untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the rest of the day close to camp, keeping my rifle nearby. I didn't see anyone. That night, I built my fire bigger than before. The light made me feel safer. I sat up late, listening to the woods, but I didn't hear anything unusual. Eventually, I went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something was moving outside my tent. I lay still, listening. It was slow, careful, like someone trying to be quiet. I reached for my rifle, moving as little as possible. The sound stopped. I held my breath. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate step in the dirt. I sat up quickly and unzipped the tent, rifle in my hands. My fire had burned down to embers, but there was enough light to see movement at the edge of the clearing. A man. He was standing just inside the tree line, half hidden by the darkness. He was tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see his face. He didn't move. I raised my rifle. He still didn't move. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to break the silence. I just stared at him, waiting for him to do something. Finally, after what felt like forever, he turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, feeding it more wood, keeping my rifle in my lap. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my gear, loaded everything into my truck, and got the hell out of there. On the way back down the dirt road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me leave. I never saw him again, but I never went back to that spot either.